I have a strange feeling like I'm at home. It's an extraordinary feeling, which hits you when you're in parts of California and Alaska, in places where there were Russians. Yuri Maros is a well-known Russian director making a film about the history of Fort Ross. This fortress was founded by Russian pioneers in America 2 centuries ago in what is now California. This story is about time travel. The main characters are our contemporaries. Suddenly, they appear in 1820. This is when Fort Ross and Russian America were in their heyday. Then the characters moved to 1825, but I won't give away all of our secrets. The movie is a traditional love story combined with a good old-fashioned Western. The hero falls in love with a young Spanish woman, setting the stage for fighting, intrigue, politics, and of course, adventure. The initial task of the old pioneers was to explore new territories, to build, to see, to learn, to fall in love and start families, to plow, and to trade. It was in this spirit that Fort Ross was erected under peaceful circumstances. In fact, not a single shot was fired as the pioneers built their new home. The settlers of the Russian colony adapted well to their new surroundings by planting gardens, harvesting grain, and becoming proficient in hunting and fishing.
They were the first to bring glass, so Fort Ross was the first the Kuskoff House was the first building here at Colony Ross to have glass windows, so the first in all of Spanish California to have windows.
Look, it's a unique place. The harbor is small but perfectly formed. It makes a circle. It's deep enough for ships to come in. Fort Ross acted as an important trade center between Russia, the U.S., and countries in Southeast Asia. But it also served another purpose. As ships loaded with food sailed north, they brought back a fortune in the fur trade. This was the vital lifeline to the heart of Russian America, further up the coastline. Who knows what Russian America is? Alaska. Yes, it's Alaska. Professor Alexander Petrov is a doctor of historical sciences and is a world-renowned expert on Alaska and on Russian-American history. The success of the Russian-American company comes down to the vision of one man, Grigory Shelikov, a merchant from a small town called Rilsk on the southern border of Russia. If it weren't for Shelikov, there would be no Fort Ross and no Russian America where we are now. Shelikov. Let's check the year 1795. Shelikov's expedition to America was different from any other merchant's ventures at the time. Shelikov traded furs, but he also decided to annex new colonies, making them part of the Russian Empire. This is a unique log documenting Gregory Shelikov's sailing expedition in 1783. In an extraordinary move, Shelikov took his wife, Natalia, and their young son, Mikhail, on the expedition with him. A strong woman in her own right. Romantics like to say she loved him too much to let him go off alone.
I think she did, but She got married when she was very young. I don't think she really had a lot of choice in the matter, you know. And I think that she idolized her husband to a certain extent.
Dawn Leah Black is an American historian and writer, and she's been studying the history of Russian Alaska for decades. She and Professor Alexander Petrov co-wrote a book about Natalia Shelikhov and her role in the history of the region.
I think I can understand her, and therefore I identify with her, and I think that she did things that are very unusual and wonderful, and yes, she was a very unique woman, and I do identify with her.
In August 1784, Shelikhov, his wife, son, and crew sailed into Kodiak Island.
They came in through here,
Они прошли здесь,
and
прошли
they
сюда.
decided that
Они решили, что
they wanted to settle down the stream
поселиться.
right here. At any rate, that bay is Natalia Bay.
Там были основаны первые постоянные поселения в Северной Америке. Понимаете, насколько
This
важен
first settlement in North America was a very important event for the Russians and in American history as well.
важнейшим фактором в истории Соединенных Штатов.
The couple spent 2 years in Alaska and created their fortune in the fur trade. During this crucial time, the expedition laid the foundation for the development of the entire territory. Shelikhov wrote the charter of the Russian-American Company, which controlled the expansive land and defined the borders of Russian America. Shelikhov had the idea of calling this land Slava Rossiya, meaning Russia's glory. But settling this new frontier was anything but glorious.
When the Russians came to Kodiak, they were hostile, no good people.
The ranks of the expedition consisted of a volatile mix of peasants, escaped convicts, and military deserters. There was a solar eclipse a few days after the expedition arrived. The natives considered it a bad omen and attacked Shelikhov's settlement. Shelikhov and his people protected themselves ferociously and with superior cannon firepower. Life in the new frontier was anything but peaceful, as clashes with the local tribes continued with Shelikhov's brood, and even subsequently with the long-term governor of Alaska, Alexander Baranov. Critics of the Russian-American Company alleged that the group brutally kept the indigenous women and children in unfathomable conditions, while the men were sent to do the harsh work of the fur trapping. Later, Shelikhov wrote, "I tried to avoid bloodshed as much as I could, and I wished to live in peace with these people."
My mother and dad said the best people in the world. Okay, and when I went to my mom and dad, what did the Russians take away from you when you were growing up? They said absolutely nothing.
Shelikhov worked hard to provide a better quality of life for the native tribes. He gave them tools and equipment, taught farming, and even organized a school system.
The Russians brought huge herds of dairy cattle. My mom was making butter when she was 8 years old. The Russians brought raspberries, and they brought gardening. They taught my mom and dad how to plant potatoes in the sand with using kelp for fertilizer.
The news of this developing cooperation began to spread, and soon other natives started to ask for help and protection from the Russians.
Tried to make friends with the
Попытался
natives.
подружиться с ними.
He brought them aboard his ship, he gave them
Судьи
presents.
принимал,
He
дарил
really
подарки.
tried to make friends because
Правда,
he
сказал,
wanted native people.
что он хотел, чтобы коренные работали на него.
He wanted them to work for him.
Of course, the laws of nature apply on the frontier, so you can imagine that it didn't take long for the Russian men to become intrigued by the local beauties. After 9 months on Kodiak, an Alaskan population boom began. Young Aleutian women started giving birth to pretty Creoles, the so-called children of mixed marriages. New families were formed. A new integrated society was created, which began to thrive. Shelikhov wrote to the Russian government to find out how to deal with this unique situation. The answer? to make them all Russian citizens. The Russian settlers recognized the local population as true Russian citizens with all that it has entailed. Russians have lived in Alaska for generations. The families grew large, creating new traditions, assimilating different cultures, while still preserving their Russian identity.
This building is the oldest building in Kodiak, and in fact, it's the oldest building in Alaska, still standing. It's over 200 years old.
Whoa! Russian journalist Anna Vernaya has been living in Alaska for 20 years. She is collecting information about the descendants of the old pioneers. Her goal is to produce a book with interviews detailing their versions of the history of Russian Alaska. This is Gilda, her daughter Tammy, and Tammy's daughter Nikita. They are a big family with a very well-known name in the region, Shelikov. The family business is fishing.
This is delicious, Gilda. Thank you very much. It's very good.
The small town of False Pass on Unimak Island is the Shelikovs' family home. Gilda is the chairman of the local fish processing company. Since fishing is a seasonal business, Gilda spends the winter months on the mainland in Anchorage, a city where there is a street named in Grigory Shelikov's honor.
This one is Shelikov.
Yeah, and even though ours has 2 L's and 2 F's, it's still pronounced Shelikov, same way.
Same pronunciation, the same pronunciation, yeah.
Yes.
This one and your. Doesn't matter how many F's
No,
or
no.
L's you
Yeah.
have.
But there is a mystery in Gilda's family lineage. Her great-grandfather bore a different Russian name, Dushkin, and no one really knows where the current family name of Shelikov came from. According to journalist Anna Vernaya, it is a known fact that Grigory Shelikov only had children with his wife Natalia.
Because he had only 2 daughters.
Right. So apparently what happened is somewhere in here, and it's not clear what happened, is Aleuts were baptized and given the name of the sponsor. So there are 2 ways. You could marry a Russian and get the name, or you could get it through baptismal.
To gain a godfather or godmother for the native children in Alaska was very important for the Aleuts. Aleuts respected their godfathers even more than their fathers by blood. They never worked for another merchant, but showed loyalty only to their godfather. When the merchant left for a year and gave them an order to get lots of furs, they did everything that was asked of them. An essential part of Russian culture is religious faith. Just like the merchants and traders, the missionaries were faced with many and various challenges. But while traders could go home, a journey to Alaska for a priest meant a lifelong commitment.
My mom and dad were with the Orthodox Church all their life.
Grigory Shelikov organized the first visit of Russian Orthodox missionaries to Alaska in 1794. Among 11 priests from Valam was Saint Herman of Alaska, who was canonized in 1970.
And we were part of the information that they gave for facts to canonize. Number 1, my brother couldn't see. His eyes were almost blind.
Мой брат не мог видеть.
And for years, my mom was working on his eyes, and told her, go to Monk Lagoon to Father Hillman's grave and put some dirt on his eyes, and drink holy water all the time from the river in Monk's Lagoon. Monk's Lagoon. Then, it wasn't long, he could see. That's all. Then I know another one about
Father Inokenti a local priest from modern-day Kodiak, is getting ready for a boat trip to Spruce Island, where Saint Herman spent his last years and was buried. It's about 2 kilometers from Monk's Lagoon.
And this cell is preserved from essentially the last time that Father Grossom was able to live here. His library, portions of his library are here. Father Grossom loved to be, he was very creative, and he did these dioramas. Christ in the Garden of Gethsemane, Saint Mary of Egypt, and you can see the moss that he used is still green.
Father Innocenti, rector of the church, refers to the island where Saint Herman lived with religious reverence.
If you look at the moss on the trees, this is very unique to this part of the island. And so here is where, on the island, is where Orthodoxy first came to North America. And a very famous story of a tsunami that was coming, and he placed an icon of the Mother of God, the Theotokos, and declared to the people that the tsunami wave wouldn't go beyond that line. In so doing, the people came and were baptized and became Russian Orthodox.
Religion still plays an important role in modern-day Alaska. Here, you'll find an unusual mix of Eastern Orthodox traditions and the local people's ancient rituals. The church defended the local population and stood up for the Aleuts. Perhaps a strong connection still exists today because the native people always found an advocate in the Orthodox Church. In fact, St. Benjamin was quite impressed by the moral purity of the local tribes. Shortly after his arrival in Alaska, he wrote, "They're no better people than the Aleuts."
Welcome to Alaska.
The indigenous people of Alaska are now, of course, thoroughly modern. And like all of us, enjoy the technology and comfort that the 21st century has to offer. But just as important are their deeply held cultural and spiritual beliefs. If you ask about their Russian heritage, they don't talk about the Russian-American Trading Company. Rather, they talk about the Russian Orthodox Church, which they call their own. They say, "This is our culture. These are our traditions." This is an Aleutian cemetery. Through the years, it has become a tradition to paint the small tents over each grave in bright colors. To compensate for the harsh, cold climate here, the dead are buried with warm blankets. The aim of these rituals is to ensure a happy and comfortable afterlife for the departed. Here you can see how important it was for the Aleuts to hold on to their old Russian traditions.
Okay.
Hey, speak of old things.
Stari Knigi.
Thank you.
This is actually St. Innocent's diary. Yeah, you can't touch it. You have to have white.
This is St. Yakov Netzvatov, Aleut, actually Creole priest, who brought the Orthodox Christian faith to the Athabascan and Yupik.
St. George translated the Bible from Russian, his father's native language, to his mother's, helping to further spread the Russian ideologies and religious traditions throughout Alaska.
Had these stones inscribed, and in our archaeological work on the island, and he married an Eliot woman, and they had 3 sons, and one of those sons became the first priest.
The distinct onion domes of Russian Orthodox architecture still exist in the area today. In America, believers can pray in the presence of the icons that were brought from Russia almost 200 years ago, in churches scattered throughout Alaska and in parts of California.
Вот эти вот у нас остатки керамики этого периода. Это где-то вот Сибирь или вот северо-запад. Вот судя по раскраске, видите?
Fort Ross was built in California in 1812 by Shelikov's men. The fortress burned down several times, but it was always rebuilt, providing a unique window to the past. Artifacts recovered through various excavations have been placed in a local museum for tourists to enjoy. However, in 2010, a crisis loomed over the facility, and it seemed that the Russian landmark, with 2 centuries of tradition and history, would be lost forever. Because of financial trouble and politics, a list of unprofitable cultural buildings in California was made at the governor's office. The list included Fort Ross. Our former governor, Schwarzenegger, was going to close the fortress. There wasn't any money. It was a crisis. The people of Sonoma County, California, couldn't imagine their community without this important Russian landmark, and thus began a campaign to save Fort Ross. At that time, I was President Obama's advisor and really supported the project. The Russian government provided financing for the project. Russia and America are superpowers. That's what we are. And as such, we have certain responsibilities to the world. As we expanded our respective territories, we met in California, and this is part of our shared history. To Russia, Michael McFall has visited sites in Alaska and Fort Ross in California many times. Fort Ross especially holds fond memories for the ambassador because it was here that he proposed to his future wife, Donna Norton. It was a very romantic place. They say it has preserved the Russian spirit. I don't really know about that. This place was more about us than about Russia. The location was perfect, and I'm very glad our engagement took place there. It was a happy and mutual decision, and we are still together. And speaking of romance, one of Russia's celebrated tales comes from this era in Russian-American history. The stage is set in April 1806, when Grigory Shelikov's son-in-law, Nikolai Ryazanov, arrived in San Francisco. The love story that unfolded during his visit gained fame in Russian pop culture in a sad but beautiful rock opera staged by Moscow's Lenkom Theater in the early 1980s. Here is my favorite character of Russian America. Have you heard about Nikolai Ryazanov? In 1803, his beloved wife Anna died, leaving him 2 children. The disconsolate widower set off on his first trip around the world. The purpose of Ryazanov's visit was to get food and bread for the Russians in Alaska and to establish friendly relations with the Spanish governor of Upper California. At some point, Ryazanov met the governor's 15-year-old daughter, Concepcion Arguello. They fell in love, and Ryazanov proposed. But tragedy soon struck, and the doomed couple was never to marry. Nikolai Ryazanov died just 2 months after leaving California for St. Petersburg. The governor's daughter, Concepcion Arguello, is buried here in St. Dominic's Cemetery in Benicia, California. This is her grave. She died almost 50 years after Ryazanov, still true to her love. Every day for a year, Concepcion would come to the sea, waiting and hoping for his return. Ryazanov died during his journey to St. Petersburg, where he was supposed to report to the Tsar about securing good prospects for the empire in North America. When the news of Ryazanov's death reached Concepcion, she chose a life of celibacy and became a nun, Sister Dominica. Skeptics maintained that the couple's engagement was merely a political trick designed to create a diplomatic bond with the Spanish government in California. But romantic history buffs know the truth. It's a myth that Nikolai Ryazanov's proposal to Concepcion Arguello was some sort of a ploy, and that he was prepared to give up his freedom for the benefits of his country. In his last letter to his brother-in-law, Mikhail Buldak, he wrote about his love for Concepcion and that he was brokenhearted. Back in Alaska, it can be said that there is now a new Russian America. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, it is estimated that more than 5,000 Russians moved to the 49th U.S. state. Now, they have assimilated and are part of the local community. On the surface, it all looks like a typical rural American town. Here, Russians live in harmony with Yupiks and other native groups, and it makes them better people for it. Yupiks in particular are welcoming, but they never forgive lies. If you deceive them just once, they and their whole community will never trust you again. It is because of this trusting and open environment in the remote villages of Alaska that people don't lock their doors. Though the heritage is very similar, Russia itself seems so distant to many of the Russian-American descendants living in the U.S. So it seems only natural that the Komarov family is on a pilgrimage of sorts from the Kauskat village in Alaska. They have come to the old town of Borovsk on the Russian mainland to see and experience the home of their ancestors.
I think that's why we're here, because we're Russian Orthodox. You know, we came here to see Russian Orthodoxy in real life instead of just what we know in our village.
In the Alaskan village where Anastasia Komarova lives, people still think that the words Orthodox and Russian are synonymous. They are wonderful people. People who are living there 120 years after Alaska was sold. Still, they say that they are Russian. I heard them singing in the churches in the Aleut language, but with a Russian feel. And their names are Russian.
Anna, my granddaughter, and I was teaching her Russian. So I wrote her about 200 or 300 words, and the only way I could teach her Russian was to write them down in English letters. To go back to my mom and dad, my dad went only to Russian school. My mom went only to Russian school.
Church school, right?
Yeah. At a park, their only education was Russian.
The first schools in Alaska were built by Grigory and Natalia Shelikov. Later, those children who wanted to continue their education were brought to the city of Irkutsk in Russia. They lived in Natalia Shelikova's home. She took care of them, helped them, and provided for their needs. Natalia Shelikova was indeed a smart woman. She was truly the business lady of her time. She knew how to deal with profit-driven traders and merchants. She also knew how to bargain and wasn't afraid to say no to the power brokers. She accomplished so much, and yet she herself couldn't write. Natalia chose husbands for her daughters, a merchant, Mikhail Buldakov, for her younger daughter, who was born in Alaska, and an aristocrat, Nikolai Ryazanov, for her elder daughter, Anna. The Russian-American company that continued Shelikov's enterprise was not established until July 1799. A few years after his death, his wife, Natalia, made it her mission in life to continue her husband's work, and was quite successful in making that happen. She appointed her son-in-law, Mikhail Buldakov, as director of the Russian-American company. The Russian-American company led Russia's trade in North America and cooperated with all the nations in the region right up until 1867, when Alaska was sold to the United States of America.
It was very profitable trade, and the Russian-American company happened to be the most profitable shareholding company in the 19th century.
Unfortunately, Natalia Shelikova didn't live to see the glory of her achievements. It happened that the business was taken from Natalia by her sons-in-law, and she was left to her own devices. She started drinking and died in 1810. She is buried somewhere in the Donskoy Monastery Cemetery in Moscow, but the location of her grave is unknown. Her relatives were negligent and didn't take the trouble to preserve the memory of this great woman. Grigory Shelikov, the Russian seafarer and pioneer, died in 1795. 5 years after his death, his widow Natalia Shelikova funded the construction of a memorial to the great man in Irkutsk, Russia. He really was the hero of his time. Everybody who knew Shelikov felt his extraordinary energy. He was no ordinary merchant. On the contrary, he explored the world, opening up new territories for his country. Grigory's talents didn't end in the realm of exploration. He was also an economic visionary. In the mid-19th century, the Russian-American company lost a sale of furs in China because of an uprising. The company started a practice in business that was unheard of at the time, hiring analysts whose sole responsibility was to follow the trends of the trade. They began to study the markets. The Russian-American company was able to command the markets in China. From California, across the Pacific Ocean, ships went to Shanghai. Later, they discovered new markets in London, New York, and even closer to home in San Francisco. That is, they were able to take advantage of policy changes in the market for the benefit of the company. Now, in the 21st century, there are many discussions at EU summits on financial markets and international trade relations. One main concern is how to make Southeast Asia a free trade zone. For Grigory Shelikov, this wasn't a problem at all. The merchant traded freely with the entire world. Here, you begin to understand what the first explorers were all about. They wanted so much more than just to come here. They wanted to bring Russian culture, together with their ideas of how to develop this land and how to make a prosperous life far away from Russia. In 2012, Fort Ross celebrated its 200th anniversary. The occasion was marked by a small ceremony in the spirit of how the settlement thrived, cooperation between the native peoples and those who hold Russian America near and dear. The dynamic days of Fort Ross mark an important era in history and international relations for both the U.S. and Russia. Had the timeline of events been altered even slightly, the political map of the United States could have looked drastically different today.
He came to the shores of the Pacific only 2 months after Lewis and Clark left Pacific and went back to the west. So basically it was the meeting of frontiers, meeting of American frontier and meeting of Russian frontier. And it's happened again exactly at the same time at the beginning of the 19th century.
To try and recapture the spirit of Fort Ross when it thrived, our film crew has had to travel to Malta, all too aware that the real Fort Ross was sold, forgotten, and nearly lost to the ages. The reason for the selling of the Russian fortress is a mystery. Even historians don't know the answer. The entire estate, where 2 Russian-named rivers, the Slavyanka and the Ruskaya, flowed, where the house with all of its equipment stood, and where gardens and orchards and even the famous Californian vineyards thrived. Everything was sold for only 42,000 rubles in silver at the time. To the north in Alaska, the end of Russian America is an even sadder memory. The territory, vast enough to hold England, France, Spain, and Germany, combined, was sold for only $7.2 million. In other words, just 2 cents an acre. The money funded the Moscow Railway's Moscow-Ryazan-Kursk line. There was a diplomatic scandal in the U.S. after the purchase of Alaska. Congress even created a commission to verify the circumstances of the transaction. Initially, people in the U.S. thought it was an incredible mistake.
What was the most important, interesting thing? The Russian-American company directors did not know about that. Everything kept in a secret. So the Russian government actually sold Russian Alaska without informing the company that basically ruled the whole Russian territories in the North Pacific.
History has now put everything in its rightful perspective. The purchase of Alaska is considered an incredible and significant victory for American diplomacy. When was Alaska sold to America?
Спасибо.
We don't know why these decisions were taken. Someone was very clever and decided to do it. It was against the majority, but it's a part of our American history now, and we are very grateful to the wise men who brokered the deal. Russian and CIS citizens can empathize with the feeling of the population when they learned that Russian America had been sold. An empire split. But Creoles and Aleuts are happy. And people might wonder what their fate would have been had Alaska been part of the Soviet Union when it collapsed. What would have become of Alaska? We can say that history has been kind to Alaska in this regard.
My own opinion, I think it was a good deal for us living here. Your government would never be able to control us. Born and raised here, we got everything here, and we got a very, very good education from the Russians, and I'm so proud to be a Russian.